This video recaps the cleanup efforts at the Duvall Cemetery in the Westridge Development of Lake Ridge, Virginia, about 30 miles south of Washington, D.C., if you aren't from the area. The cemetery is relatively small. It's 40 by 40. I'm not terribly sure how many exact graves there are there, but there's at least 2, possibly as many as 6. This cemetery was maintained at one time, but it's gone into dilapidation. There's a lot of overgrowth, there's a lot of brush and leaves that are built up on the site. This stone is the only marked stone that you're seeing in the video right now, and it reads M.E. Duvall. And if you notice, there doesn't seem to appear to be any text below the name. For a long time, the stone was basically almost covered with leaves and debris, and it was never known that it said something underneath it, but later it reveals a secret, a very nice secret, so we'll talk about that later. Here I am just starting to clean up. This is a 3-phase process. The first phase obviously is picking up all the sticks and leaves and trimming the trees, picking up all the dead limbs, and doing the initial cleanup. Phase 2 is locating all of the stones and all of the graves. Once you rake the entire property, it's easier to see depressions and rows. Most graves are in rows if there's multiple. So clearing everything lets you see that stuff easier. And then phase 3 is just a periodic maintenance, once or twice a season. It's very important to finish phase 1 before you go on to phase 2, because you can get quickly distracted and neglect your duties of phase 1 by getting excited from stones and other stuff that you find on phase 2. So it's very important to stick to the game plan. This cemetery started probably in the 1880s. A man by the name of Andrew Jackson Duvall married a young woman who was 18 years old, whose father recently passed away, who owned a lot of land in the area. Once her father passed away, her mother allowed the adult children to divide up a lot of land amongst themselves and basically have it for no money exchanged. She gave it to them for love and admiration, is what the deed said, I believe. This woman married Andrew Jackson Duvall, and her sister was named Nancy, and she married Henry Andrew Duvall, and they were related. Duvalls they were half brothers, and the parcels that they were given are close by. They're just a few hundred yards apart. The parcel that this cemetery wound up being on was 93 acres, which was the largest parcel. And so they got that in 1859. They were also married in 1858 or 1859. Sarah was 18, and her new husband, Andrew Jackson Duvall, was 11 years older than her. But they lived on this property. They had a farm. They raised whatever farm stuff they could to sustain themselves. And from what I could tell, they pretty much just stayed on the farm. It was kind of off the beaten path of the main road. So they were very secluded back in the area. And they had 8 children who lived past infancy. And they kept this property for a very long time. William Henry Duvall is the father of both Andrew Jackson Duvall and Henry Andrew Duvall. The later part of his years, he was living with Henry Andrew Duvall on the neighboring farm, and in 1873 he died at the age of 84. So he may have been the first one to be buried at the cemetery. There's no marked stone for him, so it's hard to tell. That was in 1873. In 1881, Andrew Jackson and his wife had a baby boy who died at only 3 days old. So that was February of 1881. It's very, very likely that that baby boy was buried in this cemetery. So that baby boy might have been the first burial here. Again, there's no marked stones, we don't know. And then in 1883, Henry Andrew Duvall's 13-year-old daughter died of the measles, and she is buried in this cemetery. Her stone is the only carved stone in the cemetery. It's marked M.E. Duvall. And once I cleared the brush and some leaves around the stone and took a closer look, I realized that underneath the initials M.E. and then the last name Duvall, it says died December the 7th, 1883. Finding the date carved on the stone is very important because Andrew Jackson Duvall and his wife had two daughters themselves, and their names were Margaret E. Duvall and Mary E. Duvall. If you remember, the initials carved on the stone are M.E. Duvall. So finding the date of death is very important because death records from the time do have an M.E. Duvall, who is Martha Duvall, and it noted that she died on December 7th or 6th, 1883, which matches up with the stone. So that's how I was able to determine that it was actually Martha E. Duvall, the daughter of Henry Andrew Duvall, the half-brother of the person who owned the land, who was actually buried there, and not one of Andrew Jackson's daughters. Since the father of Andrew Jackson Duvall and Henry Andrew Duvall died in 1873, he most likely started the cemetery, and then Martha was buried in the same cemetery, even though it was not property that was owned by her parents. It was owned by a family member, which was common. There's usually a common cemetery that the whole family uses, even extended family, cousins, uncles, stuff like that. The actual cemetery here is pretty small, but the piece of land it's on is fairly large. It's skinny, but it's deep. But I didn't want to leave all of the stuff that I collected from the cemetery on the site, so I loaded it up into my truck and took it to the dump. This viney stuff you see on the ground is called periwinkle. It's not native and it was planted on purpose at cemeteries. So it's a good indication when you do find it that there might be a cemetery nearby. It grows slow and it doesn't really get too high. Over time it'll take over a larger area. But the leaves falling on it and packing up can kill it off or just stunt its growth. So raking all the leaves out of it will hopefully get it to grow a little bit more and spread some more. Andrew Jackson and Sarah Duvall's second child of 8 was a son named Abraham Lincoln Duvall. He was born in 1861 on the farm, most likely, and he grew up on the farm. He married a woman from Prince William County named Laura Virginia Rhine in 1889 in Washington, D.C. After they got married, they moved to Lorton, Virginia. And they only had one child, a son named William Howard Duvall. William Howard Duvall grew up and joined the military. He was in the Navy. And he had a couple of kids, and his middle child, I believe it was middle, was a son named Robert Selden Duvall, which is the American actor Robert Duvall. Lately, for each cemetery I work on and clean up, I carve a cemetery identification stone. It's a type of sandstone or Virginia bluestone. It's fairly soft stone, but they're large slabs. And I'll carve the name of the cemetery in it along with the word cemetery, and then I'll prop it up in the ground. I'll dig a hole and put about 1/3 of it in the ground. So here I am drawing the words out or the letters out. Sometimes I print these out on a computer in just a standard font or fancy font, whatever I feel like. But this one I drew by hand. Back to the history of the site for a minute. Andrew Jackson Duvall died in the late 1890s, and on the 1900 census, his wife is still living on the property with an older man named John Duvall. I'm not sure who that was. She kept the property until 1913 when she sold it to her son for $500. In 1913, it was still the 93 acres that they originally acquired in 1859, which is pretty impressive. And then in 1914, a year later, um, Harvey Duvall, her son, sold it to two gentlemen. And in that deed, it mentions the graveyard. This is the only deed where it mentions a graveyard. The only thing it says about the graveyard is that the sale does not include the 40 by 40 foot graveyard that is contained within 4 stones. It most likely had 4 boundary stones, which obviously probably aren't there today. They're probably long gone. I didn't see any, that's for sure. Considering now it's in a development, I'm sure they're long gone. Here I am in the garage carving the stone. I'm using letter chisels. They're long and skinny with a pointy, pretty sharp end, pretty narrow end. They have a carbide tip in the end. So I put the piece of paper on there and then did the outline of the letters through the piece of paper, then removed the piece of paper, and then just start carving. That little hammer I'm using is called a bell hammer in America. Overseas it's called a dummy hammer. It weighs about 1.5 pounds, and you just tap the chisel a whole bunch of times and it knocks the stone out. There I switched chisel to a smaller one that's a 4mm tip, and the bigger one is an 8mm tip. These chisels are hard to find in America. These were actually made in Italy and they're sold by a UK company. But the UK company sells them on eBay and they ship internationally, so I was able to get some. I looked in America and I really couldn't find a whole lot. I did wound up buying some from an American supplier and I didn't like them, so I just use these now. That type of carving is the big letters are probably called a V-cut carve, where it's just, cut in the rock like a V. Some of the ones I've done in the past were flat on the bottom. It just depends on the size of the letters and how thick the stone is and how hard it is to carve. This is fairly soft from what I can gather, but it's pretty dense, so maybe it's not soft, I don't remember. On this stone, I did put the date, the rough date. I usually don't do that because sometimes you just don't know, or there's too many stones, or there's a lot of field stones that aren't dated, so you don't really know when the cemetery was, but I was fairly confident since there was only one stone here that I could say it was 1880s. Now that the stone is done, I took it out to the cemetery and I'm going to dig the hole and put it in the ground. My friend Larry came out to help me. He even dug a little bit. How nice of him. I think this stone was 40 inches wide or so, and I tried to put it about 1/3 of the way in the ground, so I think I dug the hole 12 or 13 inches deep. And I made these little steel dolly things that attached to the base of the stone, and then you can wheel it around. You can see them in the video there. That stone probably weighs easily 300 pounds, so it's nice to have the little wheel dollies. When we put these in, we tilt them forward a little bit so the water doesn't hit the face of it. Hopefully the water will just hit the edge of it and miss the face of it and not run down the face. This will extend the life of the stone. It'll still last well over 100 years, well past any of us. And it looks like we're done. This is a walkthrough. Pay attention real quick because you're about to see a before. There you go. So it's a big improvement. It's pretty neat how quickly you can change the look of a cemetery with just a couple of afternoons of picking up sticks and leaves. Obviously, in a couple of years, this will be back to what it was, but if we can stay up on top of it and pick up all the sticks, rake it or blow the leaves once in a while, it'll be a huge improvement. Now I think we're going to get a close-up look at that stone where you'll be able to see the writing below the initials. There it is. You can read where it says died. It reads died December the 7th, 1883. And that's about it. In a minute, I think there'll be a couple of pictures from previous projects. This is the first project I videoed. This is the Reed Cemetery. It was heavily vandalized, and I went in and fixed the stones. This one was just an overgrown cemetery. That's the same area. Those stones were knocked over and kind of buried with vegetation, so I found them and put them upright. That one I fixed because it was broken into pieces. HistoricPrinceWilliam.org is our website. Check us out.